Hello, and welcome to a presentation on my final paper topic, going over the effectiveness of scholarship access for tertiary and vocational education training, educational programs to create inclusive communities, and looking at a comparison of the current situation in Mexico and the United States. Overall, my topics, as we looked at from the UNESCO report, was looking at the essential concept of people or inclusive social development, and how that relates to the importance of creating sustainable development in education. From there, I wanted to look at the sustainable goal, development goal of technical, vocational, tertiary, and adult education programs. And then from there, implementation target looking at scholarships. The two countries I chose to look at were Mexico and the United States, just because of the regional location. And I wanted to look at some of the different variations that I thought might be prevalent across those two countries. My research question originally that was developed was, what does the research literature say about the effectiveness of accessing scholarships for technical and vocational education programs to develop equitable and inclusive communities in the United States and Mexico? Throughout my research, I found that there were some other areas that I thought were impactful to look at. And so it also made me think about, how does political influence impact the effectiveness of educational reform and scholarship aid development in Mexico and the United States? The comparative framework that I looked at for comparative analysis was Bray and Thomas's three-dimensional framework, focusing on geographical demographics, non-locational demographics, and aspects of education and society. I felt that this would work really well to compare different information for both of these countries. I wanted to kind of look at cities, states, North America versus Latin America. Overall, in my research, I found more comparable differences to North America and Latin America versus specific cities or states. But then I also wanted to look at some non-locational demographics, such as the influence of political systems, policies, how that's impacted educational reform, definitely socioeconomic factors, potentially looking at religion, economic reform as well, and then cultural influences such as religion. And then other aspects of education and society that I kind of wanted to focus on as related to specifically to my implementation target that I wanted to explore was looking at government influence and related like aid and the scholarship access across both countries, and then access to inclusive materials, and then as well as workforce and job market trends. So based on my findings, some of the challenges as it relates to really meeting that essential concept as described in the UNESCO Sustainable Development Report is looking at regional costs to families. A lot of the data that I found gave a lot of different aspects of education and society that kind of heavily influenced the support by the government or just even public support for providing different opportunities for education. And so I found kind of primarily from two specific articles, a lot of data related to looking at comparable differences across countries in Latin America and then countries in kind of looking at the United States, but also other countries that are similar to the United States. So I found that really families in Latin America have a higher per capita income that they have to pay towards tertiary education per student per year compared with other high income countries, the United States kind of being classified as one. And living costs are more significant as well, which is an influencing factor for just the general cost to families and providing this more inclusive environment. In the United States, there are generally more contributions by individual students to funding vocational education training, even though current student contributions are just already considerably higher than made by most university students. Other non-locational demographics that I found were kind of influence and made it challenging to really hit these target goals is the influence of politics towards reform and really looking at political climate changes that impact wage structures in the flexible versus rigid labor market, and how any data that's there also impacts measuring kind of the long-term benefits of when vocational and tertiary education is accessible. It's really difficult to isolate the correlation of those benefits to other performance-based influences within the job market, and especially for looking at ages of those with tertiary education certifications as well. Other aspects of education in society that generally through all of my research I found was really the influence of mass education development and kind of throwing in a lot of reform that was just not ready, especially in the United States, pre and post-war climates and views on education and the way that privatization impacted that was a huge influence on kind of the development and the accessibility of university or private education versus vocational or job training in education. The influence of capitalism as a whole on an economic factor and how capitalist societies and countries have a different way that they will privatize education, as well as in Mexico, even looking at social capital influences as well. Gender in the workforce and in education was an area that I was hoping to find a little bit more information about, but it was more limited from the research that I found. But it does appear that there are generally more women that actually obtain some type of more trade training or programming. The overall environment of vocational training and education, looking at the cost benefit analysis of in-school programs versus workplace training and how to implement that, government versus job market and data, job market data and evidence, and I get into that a little bit more as we look at specific targets. And then overall, there's just challenges related to kind of providing a universal definition of what technical, vocational, and tertiary education looks like, because it bases off of differing country requirements for degree requirements as is, and that influences then the way that they also look at funding for those programs. And then generally, there's also lack of employer support in implementing these programs later on in the job market. Some specific challenges that I looked at as it relates to just technical, vocational, tertiary, and adult education overall is really this concept of Latin America versus North America and the US. Mexico overall, compared to other Latin American countries in a study that I found that looked at Brazil, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico, overall it has a higher participation rate and higher attainment rate and more equal gender index, but it still ranks third across those four Latin American countries for just general overall accessibility for TVET education. The United States, a lot of things that factor into funding relate to kind of the labor market regulations, influence of any trade unions, and then just the general cost demand factors of looking at skills, occupations, and then just general like specific training and the way that this can kind of provide different options. Non-locational demographics, socioeconomic factors was really a huge influence, even more so than I thought reform overall might be. That was definitely another area, but I think overall I found that socioeconomic factors played a huge role in the influence of the general cost and accessibility. Generally in Latin American countries, the net education cost is 60%, while in higher income countries like the United States, it's only slightly above 20%. And also student assistance in Mexico only improves the affordability by 1% of the GDP per capita, which I thought was really surprising. In the United States, it's really challenging to get scholars and policymakers to agree that these career fields are relevant. However, there's more evidence that is showing kind of the demand for the old school blue collar workers to provide those types of jobs, and that there are more graduates that are on the high and that those salaries are also on the rise. So that was kind of an interesting look at the socioeconomic factors. And then affordability and accessibility was definitely a huge impact of the aspects of education and society that I think then lead into the implementation target and some of the challenges there. In Mexico, on average, student assistance is really lower compared to higher income countries. In the United States, compared to general or academic education, the costs of technical, vocational, tertiary, and adult education programs are really substantial because of the types of equipment and really the sophistication of that specific job market. So that's areas that make it challenging to really implement and provide affordable and accessible access to this type of education program. And then looking at scholarships, again, it does look a lot like Latin America versus North America and the US. Really looking at participation enrollment rates and how it impacts public funding versus government funding in Mexico. Overall, Latin American countries have a lower participation and enrollment rate in this educational area than the United States. But then in the United States, there's a lot of privatization of education, including apprenticeship in the job market. That also impacts and creates challenges for scholarship opportunities. In Mexico, the direct just cost of tertiary education is considerably higher. In general, overall in Latin America, it's higher by 25% more. And then the overall cost of living and accommodation for things like food and where they live. A lot of students live at home in Latin American countries compared to even the US, where we're used to seeing more students in dorms and other areas. But if we look at the general timeline of when education for higher post-secondary takes place, the overall cost of living is just generally 10% higher in Latin American countries. So that is also an influence for scholarships. In the United States, one of the biggest factors related to providing actual more cost towards vocational education training is that a lot of employers have not been tracking data because they don't separate costs that accounts for their training. So that means that there's generally not a way to look at the cost benefit analysis of vocational and educational training, and makes it harder for more employers and businesses to actually look at the effective cost of even being able to provide apprenticeships or scholarships for these types of programs. And then again, aspects of education and society, affordability and accessibility. In Mexico, student assistance is just lower, and apprenticeships in the United States are more like public-private partnerships that go within this kind of co-funding structure. And generally, the state bears the cost of education that takes place in schools while employers finance workplace training. So if we look at scholarship opportunities and the enforcement of when vocational training can take place, it's figuring out who's going to kind of share the cost of the funding. So those are kind of just general overview of really significant things that I found across regional and just geographic location, and then impact of socioeconomic factor as I looked at the comparable framework that I used for the analysis process. Other future research questions that I would want to look at would be kind of how does age and maybe the timeline of education affect the participation rates of general TVET education programs versus job-specific training in both the United States and Mexico. I think based on what I was looking at from all of the articles and looking at the impact of reform is really the implementation and the timeline of participation and looking at enrollment rates. So I want to look a little bit further into sort of the age factors if we're going to look at job-specific training versus in-school training or education, and how that might impact future funding. And then also, how will the research really about affordability and accessibility of tertiary education impact effective policy decisions in both the United States and Mexico? And will this help create better reform options? And in my paper, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the reform area. That's one area I didn't get to touch on as much in the presentation, because of some of the similarities and contrasts that I found across both of these countries. But I do want to touch on the impact of reform a little bit more in my paper as well. So I want to know, how does the research that we're finding about affordability and accessibility for these types of educational programs impact effective policy decisions, and how will that create more inclusivity for people having more access to student assistance programs to participate in these types of education programs. Areas of further interest will really be the impact of enrollment influencing educational aid programs. As I was looking through, it did make sense to me that even for tertiary or technical vocational training programs, that it is heavily influenced by enrollment and participation rates, as I would imagine that even higher education programs and university-based degree programs are fluctuated by sometimes the political climate, but also by enrollment numbers. Also, looking at the variety of assistance programs, one of the areas that I found really interesting in the article talking about Latin American countries and overall accessibility for this education programs is looking at the benefits of different types of assistance programs, whether it's grants, scholarships, or student loans. Then looking at the economic benefits, I want to see more data that helps track in the workforce how tertiary education is expanding and improving poverty rates in different parts of these countries. And also looking at cost of living disparities, because that was one of the areas I was most struck by, is the impact of cost of living and how that influences educational assistance options, especially in Latin American countries. Other comparative approaches I would look at would be like qualitative comparative analysis. As I was looking through different comparative analysis methods, this one I thought was interesting because it looks at qualitative and quantitative information. It's been associated with looking at decision-making purposes and program-specific changes. So I thought that that was interesting. And we're looking at it from a funding perspective or just creating different programs for technical and vocational training education. Weaknesses of this, as I think we've learned a bit about comparative analysis research, is that it's hard to look at complete data sets and get the same data across the board. It involves collaboration. And this type of comparative analysis requires a sort of set number of cases, at least 10, before analysis can begin, which does give that comparative data, but it can range from like 10 to 50 cases in some areas. And if the data is not complete across the board, it's really hard to actually make the analysis for it based on the steps that are involved. I thought the steps were interesting. It's really developing a theory of change, looking at what you want to come of some type of program change, identifying the cases, and then creating a set list of factors or conditions, scoring those, and then analyzing the data set. So yeah, that's what I came across throughout my research, and overall what I've so far thought about and thinking ahead and how I would maybe reframe some of this research in the future.